For centuries, one of the primary modes of travel in much of North America involved the use of man-made canoes. First designed and built by the continent's native people, the lightweight but durable canoe would become in many ways the automobile of its day, particularly in the 1700s, as the fur trade and other forms of commerce expanded with the arrival of more and more European immigrants to the continent. Constructed of birch bark and other raw materials provided by Mother Nature, the canoe proved to be an exquisite example of form and function, and thus the ideal choice for all, native or otherwise, traveling on the numerous natural highways of early North America.
Some of the interesting characteristics about a birch bark canoe is the fact that they're unsinkable. You could weight them down with enough rocks or weights to get it to sink, but virtually everything in a birch bark canoe floats. And as a result, when you do paddle them, they're very light on the water, much like a leaf floating on the top of the water. At first glance, they look fragile, but they are quite tough. When they're dry, they're fragile. But when these are wet, they return to their original resiliency, and it's tough. The bark will absorb water, but won't let the water pass through unless there's a hole. Inside the canoe, you have planking and ribs. So the idea that, oh, this birch bark canoe, you put your foot right through it, it's fragile, it's going to break on you, it's going to require tremendous amounts of maintenance. It's not the case. It's rock hard where it's reinforced on the inside by the sheathing, the planking, and the ribs.
Yes, tough and functional it was. But fact is, despite all of its advantages, the use of traditional bark canoes had all but disappeared by the early 1900s. They had instead become nothing more than a prototype for the wood canvas and later the aluminum, fiberglass, and Kevlar canoes that would for the most part replace them in the modern world. However, largely due to the efforts of a few quality craftsmen like Spokane's John Lindman, the tradition of birch bark canoes and the skill set necessary to build them is being preserved and passed on.
The way I got started was sort of by accident. I was working for a .com startup down in Florida and was laid off. And although I had taken a class several years earlier on how to make birch bark canoes, it was just a hobby. It was something I liked to do for fun. But just coming from a .com website, the internet's now starting to explode. I figured, well, I'll just set up a little hobby farm by building a website and representing other builders. Then the bus driver for the Kenai Indians contacted me and had seen one of my ads and went to the website and saw that I did classes. And so next thing you know, I was up in Alaska on a private lake with the Kenai Indians, running a youth program, teaching them how to make a birch bark canoe, because at one point in time they did make birch bark canoes in that area. So that was the start.
In the years following his decision to devote full time to his craft, John has made and sold his share of traditional birch bark canoes. Some were assembled while teaching. Others were built to be displayed as decorative art pieces. And still more were made for those who simply desired a functional, old-fashioned canoe. Yet regardless of its proposed use, the centuries-old building process behind each one-of-a-kind handcrafted canoe is the same.
Making a birch bark canoe can be broken down into three major phases. The first is gathering the materials, and the second is preparing the materials for assembly, and the third is the assembly of the canoe. Generally, it takes about a month to do a canoe. And gathering the materials is part of that. Nowadays, the birch bark, is very rare that's of the quality necessary for a canoe. You can go through thousands of trees to find one tree that's going to be suitable for canoe in North America. And so I'm importing the bark from Siberia because the nature of the bark, it's more leather-like, it's more resilient, and it lends itself more to being able to make canoes.
The rest of the natural materials John uses to build his canoes can be found closer to home, both here in the Northwest and other parts of the U.S. Materials like spruce root, used to lash the canoe together, white spruce for the thwarts and gunnels, white cedar for the planking, and finally either pine or spruce pitch for sealing the craft. Once everything is in-house, the next phase of the process involves using a few simple hand tools to prepare the materials for assembly.
Traditionally, in terms of preparation, The root looks very raw. It twists and it's rough and you have the bark and what have you. You have to take the bark off, you have to split it, and you have to make it to the point where it's like this. The cedar is hand split, and the biggest skill, you might say, of making a birch bark canoe comes in being able to split the wood and to be able to carve it.
After a fair amount of quality time boiling, stripping, splitting, carving, bending, and cutting all the various materials to fit, what remains in the eye of the builder is the easy part.
Most people when they think of making a birch bark canoe, they think of assembly. That's about the last, third of the amount of time that it takes to make a canoe. You're coming down the home stretch when you're going to assemble it, but there's challenges all along the way. There's some parts that are very technically challenging, and it's like walking the tightrope. And there's other times where you run into tedium. But getting that canoe to look exactly the way I wanted it to, that's the biggest challenge, and that brings the biggest amount of satisfaction.
With the assembly process completed, the final step for a canoe expected to float is to make sure it passes the water test. This is done by pouring 1 to 2 inches of water inside the boat.
It's a two-man job, and one person's up here on top and rolling the canoe, and we're watching for any leaks. And then we circle them with a pencil, and then once we have it all located, it's covered with pine pitch or spruce pitch, any of that type of thing, and it's mixed with traditionally animal fat, such as bear grease, and it should be ready to go.
For one to be an expert in any field, they must have both a good deal of skill and knowledge about a special subject. Obviously, as a bark canoe maker, John Lindman meets all the requirements to be considered an expert at his craft. However, while he is proud of his many accomplishments thus far, there is still, according to John Lindman, the teacher, plenty of work to be done.
My mission statement, you might say, is reviving the art of the birch bark canoe. I want to teach more people how to make these, and a major goal of mine is to see birch bark canoe building going on all throughout Indian country, whether it's here in the United States or in Canada with First Nations people. Now, if I saw that happen, I could depart this world with a smile.
If you have an idea for Northwest Profiles, send it to KSPS TV, 3911 South Regal, Spokane, Washington 99223. Northwest Profiles is a presentation of KSPS Public Television.